South Texas, 1878. A 19-year-old widow stands in the dead of night, her freshly cut hair scattered in the dirt at her feet, staring down a stranger without blinking. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Thorne. I'm looking for an honest wage, and I'll pull my own weight." Gideon Thorne looks at the hair on the ground, then back at her face. No tears, no trembling, just the eyes of someone who decided tonight whether she lives or disappears. He picks up his tin mug, takes a slow drink, sets it down. 1 week. What she doesn't know, 2,000 miles of open trail stand between her and everything she's never had. Storms, gunfights, a man hunting her down, and a trail boss who's starting to realize he doesn't want her there just because she can cook. This is the story of Marin Vance, a 19-year-old widow, a butcher knife, and the longest road of her life. Follow along, because next, she's going to have to choose between running and fighting back. And trust me, you don't want to miss what she chooses. The sun had no mercy in South Texas. It beat down on everything: the cracked earth, the sagging fence posts, the little cabin that sat at the edge of town, like something the town itself had tried to forget. The wood was gray and warped. The roof leaked when it rained. It had never felt like home, not once in 2 years, but it was the only shelter Marin Vance had ever been able to call her own. She was done with it now. She folded her spare dress, the brown one, faded to the color of old leaves, and pressed it flat into the bottom of her canvas bag. On top of that went a tin cup, a small knife, a stub of candle, and the last of the dried cornmeal she'd wrapped in cloth. She moved quickly, quietly, the way a person moves when they know someone might be listening. Her husband, Roy Vance, had been dead 4 days. He'd picked a fight at the Buckhorn Tavern with a man who was better armed and far less patient, and that was the end of Roy. Marin had felt many things standing at his grave. Relief wasn't one she said out loud, but it was the one that sat longest in her chest. She wasn't given much time to feel anything else. Coulter Vance arrived on the 3rd day. He came on horseback, Roy's older brother, with 2 of his men trailing behind him like shadows. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from riverstone. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and stood in the frame with the afternoon light at his back, and he looked around the cabin the way a man looks at something he already considers his. "You know why I'm here," he said. Marin set down the pot she'd been scrubbing. "Tell me anyway." "Roy owed me. A lot." Coulter pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his coat and held it up, though he didn't offer it to her. "Gambling debts. I've got it all written down. Names, dates, amounts, legal and proper. Roy's dead. Debt doesn't die with a man." He tucked the paper back into his coat. "You'll come work at my saloon in Abilene. 6 days a week until it's paid off. Could take a year, could take 3. Depends on how the numbers fall." Marin looked at him without blinking. She already knew what a saloon job meant for a woman who couldn't pay off what she owed. She'd heard enough stories. She had no intention of becoming one. "No," she said. Coulter smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. That wasn't a question. He left his men outside to watch the cabin and gave her until morning to pack. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room went very still. Marin stood there for a moment. Then she picked the pot back up, finished scrubbing it, set it down, and started packing. She was out the back window before midnight. She moved through the dark with her bag on one shoulder and her butcher knife tucked into her belt, staying off the main road, keeping to the dry creek bed that ran south of town. The stars were hard and bright overhead. Her boots were thin-soled and 2 sizes too big, Roy's old boots, and she could feel every rock through them. But she kept walking. She'd heard about the cattle drive from Old Pete at the feed store. 3,000 longhorns heading north to Wyoming, a man named Thorne running the outfit. They were camped 2 miles south of town, leaving at first light. She found them by the smell of wood smoke and cattle. The camp was settled in for the night, a half-moon of bedrolls around a low fire, the chuck wagon sitting dark and unlit at the far edge. A few horses moved in the rope line, One of the night riders circled the herd in the distance, nothing but a dark shape and the sound of slow hoofbeats. Gideon Thorne was awake. He was sitting on an upturned crate beside the chuck wagon with a tin mug in his hand and a map laid across his knee, held flat against the wind with two stones. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples and a face that didn't give much away. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the dry grass. His eyes were steady, not startled, not curious, just steady. Marin stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Thorne?" "Who's asking, Marin Vance?" "I'm looking for work." He looked at her the way a man reads a weather report, taking in the bag on her shoulder, the oversized boots, the hair coming loose from its pins, the butcher knife at her belt. His expression didn't change. "What kind of work?" "Camp cook. Chuck wagon. I can cook, I can keep stock, I can drive the wagon if I need to." He folded the map carefully and set it aside. "You ever been on a cattle drive?" "No, it's 2,000 miles," he said. "Mostly no roads. River crossings, lightning storms, stampedes, rattlesnakes, and men who haven't slept right in 3 weeks. It's not a journey you survive on good intentions." "I'm not running on good intentions," Marin said. "I'm running from something worse." He studied her. "I don't take on passengers. I can't carry someone who can't carry themselves." "Then don't." She kept her voice level. "Give me a week. If I can't do the work, leave me at the next town. You'll have lost nothing. I'll have lost a week. A week you would have spent feeding 12 men out of whatever the last cook left behind." She glanced at the chuck wagon. "I can smell that wagon from here, Mr. Thorne. Something went bad in one of those barrels, and no one's found it yet." A beat passed. He still didn't say yes. Marin set down her bag. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, let it fall loose around her shoulders, long, dark, and tangled from the wind. Then she reached for the butcher knife at her belt. Thorne's hand moved instinctively toward his own holster. "Easy," she said quietly, and then she took a fistful of her own hair in one hand and cut it off at the jaw in 3 clean strokes. She let the dark weight of it fall into the dirt between them. Then she raised her eyes to his and held them. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Thorne. I'm looking for an honest wage, and I'll pull my own weight." Silence. The fire crackled somewhere behind him. Out in the darkness, one of the longhorns lowed low and long. Gideon Thorne looked at the hair on the ground, then back at her face. Something shifted behind his eyes, not pity, not amusement, something closer to recognition. He'd seen that kind of desperation before, but usually in men who'd already tried everything else. He hadn't expected it here. He picked up his tin mug, took a slow drink, set it back down. "1 week," he said. "You eat what the crew eats, sleep under the wagon, and you're up before anyone else and down after everyone else. You fall behind, you get left. You cause trouble, you get left. You can't cook worth a damn, you get left. Understood. Find the bad barrel before morning." He stood, unfolding himself to his full height, and looked down at her with those flat, unreadable eyes. "We move at first light." Marin picked up her bag. "What's in the barrel?" "That's what I said." She nodded once, turned toward the wagon, and got to work. She found the barrel 20 minutes later, salt pork that had gone off, sitting wedged behind a sack of dried beans. She hauled it out and buried it 10 yards from camp, then wiped her hands on her skirt and went through the rest of the stores by the light of a single candle. She didn't let herself think about Coulter Vance, or the cabin she'd left behind, or Roy's grave, sitting crooked on the hill outside of town. She didn't let herself think about how close the edge of everything had been. She just counted the cornmeal, checked the coffee, made a list in her head for the morning. She was still awake when the sky began to lighten. So was Gideon Thorne. He didn't say anything, just refilled his mug and watched the herd begin to stir. But when the rest of the crew started rising, pulling on their boots and rolling their blankets, he jerked his chin toward the fire and said, simply, "Cook." Marin Vance built up the fire. She didn't look back. She had made her choice in the dark, with a knife in her hand and her hair in the dirt, and there was nothing left behind her worth turning around for. The trail stretched north, long, unknown, and wide open. That was enough. The Texas panhandle opened up like the inside of a furnace. No trees, no shade, just flat, wind-scored earth running all the way to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the slow drift of dust and the dark mass of 3,000 longhorns moving north. The sky was enormous out here, pale blue at the edges, white-hot at the center, and it pressed down on everything beneath it with an almost physical weight. Marin drove the chuck wagon from the front seat with the reins in both hands and her jaw set against the wind. The mules were stubborn. They always were. She was learning. They leaned into the harness when it suited them and dug their hooves in when it didn't. And there was no reasoning with a mule on a hot day. You just held on and made it clear you weren't moving either. She had been on the drive for 3 days. In that time, she had learned the shape of the crew. 12 men, not counting Gideon. They ranged in age from 17 to somewhere past 60, and they fell into loose camps. The older hands tolerated her the way they tolerated bad weather, with silence and the assumption that it would eventually pass. The younger ones were more openly skeptical. Micah was the worst of the veterans. He was a grizzled man somewhere in his 50s, with a gray beard that came to a point and eyes that had spent so long squinting into the sun they seemed permanently narrowed. He had ridden cattle drives since before Marin was born, and he wore that history like armor. He never said anything directly to her. He just talked around her, loudly, to whoever was nearby. Bad enough we're short-handed, he said on the second morning, pouring his coffee without looking at her. Now we got a cook who needs to be minded like a calf that wandered from the herd. Marin poured her own coffee and didn't answer. Laramie was younger, maybe 22, with sandy hair and a mouth that moved faster than his brain. He wasn't mean the way Micah was. He was just loud, and loud was its own kind of problem on a long drive. He told the man next to him at breakfast that a woman on a cattle drive was bad luck, same as a black cat or a busted axle, and he said it just loud enough to make sure she heard. She heard. She also made sure his biscuits were slightly smaller than everyone else's. Not enough to complain about. Just enough for him to notice. But the real trouble came on the third evening. She had set up the fire ring in the shelter of the wagon's windward side, Dutch oven already nested in the coals, and she was working through the salt beef and dried onion she'd been soaking since noon. The wind had been picking up all afternoon, a steady, insistent push from the southwest that flattened the grass and made the mules unhappy. She should have noticed it sooner. She didn't. The gust came hard and sideways, the kind that carries grit and small stones, and the smells of something electric. It hit the fire ring like a fist. The coals scattered. The heat beneath the Dutch oven collapsed in an instant, and when Marin pulled the lid carefully with her clotha, the stew inside was barely warm. The beef was still tough, the onions still raw at the center. She set the lid down. 12 men were waiting. They'd been in the saddle since before dawn, pushing cattle across terrain that offered no shade and no water until mid-afternoon. They were tired, in the particular way of men who have nothing left to be tired with. They needed a hot meal and a few hours of sleep before the night riders took over. She looked at the Dutch oven. She could serve it as it was. Some of them might not even notice. She didn't. She rebuilt the fire from scratch. The wind fought her every step. She had to curl her body around the kindling to keep the flame alive long enough to catch. And her fingers were red and stinging by the time she had coals enough to work with. She repositioned the wagon to cut the wind at a better angle, dragging the wheel chocks around by herself because no one offered to help. She got the Dutch oven back over the heat and clamped the lid down with a flat stone on top to hold the seal. Then she waited. She didn't sit. She crouched beside the fire with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, tending the coals, her face hot and her hands blistered where the heat had caught her. The sun was fully down by the time the stew was right. She served it without a word. Micah took his plate and looked into it. He didn't say anything. He just ate. Laramie got his plate and started to say something about the weight. The man beside him, an older hand named Cull, who rarely spoke, said, "Eat it," without looking up. Laramie ate it. Gideon had watched all of it. He always seemed to be watching, not with the dramatic intensity of a man performing his authority, but with the quiet attention of someone who needed to know the state of every moving part. He stood at the edge of the firelight while the men ate, his plate in one hand, and he looked at the mules repositioned against the wind. He looked at the drag marks in the dirt where she'd moved the chocks alone. He looked at her hands, still red from the fire. He didn't say anything to her that night, but the next morning, before the crew was up, he came to the chuck wagon while she was measuring coffee grounds, and he said, quietly, "Good call on the mules." That was all. She counted it as something. The real problem came at the end of the first week. It started with a comment she never caught exactly who said it first. Just heard the tail end of it as she was coming back from the water barrel. Something about how women who cut their hair short were the kind you didn't bring home. There was laughter. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. She didn't react. She went back to the fire and started on the noon meal. But Gideon had heard it. He finished saddling his horse slowly, deliberately, and then he turned and walked back to camp with the reins loose in his hand. He stopped at the fire ring where the crew was gathering for coffee, and he waited until he had all of them. "Put your cups down," he said. "All of you." The laughter stopped. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in his stillness that made noise seem unnecessary. The quiet of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and had no doubt anyone would hear it. "We're going to talk about how this outfit runs," he said once, "and then it's done." He looked at each of them in turn. Micah, Laramie, the others. Out here she's not a woman. She's the camp cook, the person feeding this outfit. He let that land before he continued. "Anyone who touches her or fails to respect the person keeping you fed and alive on this trail will be stripped of their pay and left on the prairie without a horse." No one spoke. "That's not a threat," Gideon said. "It's how this works. Same code that applies to every man here applies to her. She earns her wage the same way you earn yours, by doing the job. So far, she's doing it." He picked up his reins again. "Any questions?" There weren't. He mounted up and rode out to the herd without looking back. Marin kept her eyes on the fire. She stirred the pot. She didn't let herself look up until she heard his horse moving away, and then she glanced sideways once across the crew. Micah was looking at her. For the first time since the drive began, his eyes were straight on, not measuring, not assessing, just looking. He picked up his cup, took a long drink. "Set it down. Biscuits ready," he said. "5 minutes, Marin told him. He nodded and pulled out his pocket knife and started cleaning his nails, which was the closest thing to a peace offering she figured she was going to get from Micah for a while. She'd take it. Over the next few days, something shifted, slowly and without ceremony. Cull started leaving the water barrel closer to the chuck wagon, so she didn't have to carry it as far. One of the younger hands, a quiet Mexican boy named Santos, started helping her collect firewood in the evenings without being asked. Laramie, for his part, stopped making comments and started eating his food with what she could only describe as sincerity. She didn't make a fuss over any of it. She just cooked. She was up before dawn every day. Coffee first, always. Because 12 men with no coffee were 12 men with no patience, and patience was what kept a drive running smooth. Then biscuits or cornbread, salt pork or dried beef, whatever she could make stretch. At noon, she left food in the wagon for the riders who couldn't come back to camp. At night, she did it all over again, bigger and hotter, because the evening meal was the one that had to hold them through until morning. Her hands stopped blistering. Calluses formed instead, thick and reliable. She learned which way the wind usually turned by late afternoon, and she positioned the fire ring accordingly. She learned that the Dutch oven held heat better with the coals banked a certain way. She learned the mules' names, Chester and Blind Tom, Though Tom wasn't actually blind, just half blind in one eye, and particular about which side you approached from. She learned the rhythm of the trail. It wasn't easy. She hadn't said it would be. But on the seventh evening, when she set the beans on the fire, and Micah walked over without being asked and steadied the pot when the wind knocked it sideways, she let out a slow breath she felt like she'd been holding since South Texas. She wasn't just surviving. She was part of the outfit. And nobody, not Micah, not Laramie, not the wind or the heat or the 1,200 miles still ahead, was going to be able to take that from her. The storm came without much warning. There had been signs. If you knew what to look for a particular stillness in the late afternoon air, the way the cattle bunched and turned their heads south, the color the sky went at the edge of the horizon, greenish and low and wrong. The old hands noticed it. You could see it in the way they moved through the evening, quieter and more deliberate than usual, tightening cinches that didn't need, tightening and checking ropes they'd already checked. Marin noticed it too. She doubled the ties on the supply tarps without anyone telling her to, knotted them twice around the wagon cleats, and moved the flour and salt barrels away from the wagon's open side, pushing them flush against the footboard where the overhang gave them a little protection. By the time the sun went down, the air tasted like iron. The lightning started around midnight. It began far off, flickering at the edge of the plains like something nervous, lighting the underside of the clouds in pale purple and white. The thunder followed slow and rolling, not close enough yet to be frightening, just present. The night riders were already moving, pushing the cattle into a tighter circle, voices low and steady. Then the first bolt hit close. It came straight down out of the sky, with a sound like the world cracking in half, and the flash was so bright, it turned everything white. For a full second, Marin, asleep under the wagon, was upright before the thunder finished rolling. She could feel the ground shake with it. The herd moved. It wasn't a sound you could describe well after the fact. It started as something you felt before you heard a vibration through the earth. Low and insistent, rising, fast. Then the noise came. 3,000 animals in full run, hooves hitting the ground in an overlapping roar that swallowed everything else. The chuck wagon lurched sideways as one of the mules threw itself against the harness in blind panic. Marin was on her feet in 2 seconds. Around her, the camp was chaos. Men running for their horses, shouting over the wind and thunder, the firelight lurching and tilting as the wind tore at it. Someone was screaming at the rope line to hold. The cattle were close too close, the ground shaking harder now, and she could hear the clatter of horns and the breathing of animals pushed past fear into something purely animal and unstoppable. She grabbed the heavy canvas tarp she'd strapped over the supply stores. It was writhing in the wind like a living thing, straining hard against the ropes, the knots she'd tied popping under the pressure. If it went, if the flour and salt went, the crew would have no bread, no preservation, nothing to keep meat through the miles ahead. On a 2,000-mile drive, losing your staples wasn't just an inconvenience. It could end the whole thing. She threw herself against the tarp. It was like pushing against a wall of water. The wind was coming straight and hard now, cold and full of grit, and the canvas snapped and shuddered against her weight. She got her shoulder into it and drove her boots into the dirt and hauled on the loose rope end with both hands. Her palms burned. She wrapped the rope around her forearm for leverage and pulled. The wagon shifted. She didn't see it coming. One of the mules, crazed and screaming, lunged sideways in the harness, and the whole wagon moved with it. The rear wheel caught her in the shoulder and knocked her clean off her feet. She hit the ground hard and stayed there for a moment, the breath knocked out of her, rain starting now, cold and driving, the canvas snapping above her head. She got up. She didn't think about it. Her shoulder was screaming, and her knees were cut where she'd hit the dirt. But she got up and grabbed the rope again, and this time she got it around the cleat and knotted it down in the pattern she'd learned from watching the older hands lash loads. 1 wrap, 2, Cross it back, pull until your arms shook. The tarp held. She stood there in the rain, with her forehead against the side of the wagon and her whole body shaking, listening to the thunder roll away and the stamped herd begin to slow in the distance. The ground stopped moving by degrees, like something winding down. Gradually, the roar of hooves became the sound of cattle milling and bawling instead of running, and the voices of the cowboys filtering back out of the dark became steadier, more organized. The storm moved east. The lightning kept up for another hour, but it was walking away from them now. By the time the riders came back, and the fire was rebuilt from scratch in the shelter of the wagon's lee side, there wasn't much left of the night. Most of the men just unsaddled their horses and sat close to the fire with their hats in their hands, too tired to talk. The tally came in, piece by piece, 60 head, missing from the first count, probably scattered across 4 miles of dark prairie, would need to be gathered at first light. Nobody hurt, no horses down, the wagon intact. Gideon walked the camp perimeter once before he came back to the fire. He sat down near Marin without ceremony, the way he did most things, and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd put on, the moment she had coals going again. He drank for a while. The fire crackled and popped and sent sparks up into the wet air. Then he said, "Let me see your shoulder." "It's fine, it's not." He said it without looking at her. "You took a wheel in it. I saw it." She hesitated, then turned her back to him and shifted her coat and the collar of her shirt off the left shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. "Bad bruise," he said. "Might be worse in the morning. Can you move the arm?" She rotated it carefully. It hurt, but it moved. Yes. He pulled something from his saddlebag, a tin of salve, the kind the outfit kept for rope burns and cuts, and handed it to her without making a production of it. She took it. She was reaching to set her coat back in place when she felt him go still. Not the kind of still that meant he was waiting for something. The kind that meant he'd seen something he hadn't expected. The scars on her back were old, faded to silver, most of them, thin and ropey, and running in the particular diagonal lines that only come from one kind of instrument. She'd kept them covered carefully for months, then years, and she'd almost stopped thinking about them as something other people might see. She pulled her coat back up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. When Gideon did speak, his voice was quieter than it had been, but there was something underneath it, a controlled, deliberate anger that he clearly had no interest in directing at her. "Roy Vance," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. She'd told Gideon her married name the first night. He was smart enough to put the rest together. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He looked at the fire, and his jaw was tight, and his hands around the coffee tin were still. He sat like that for a while, not saying anything about her, not saying anything at her, just sitting with it. Then, without looking away from the fire, he pulled back the left side of his own shirt at the collar, far enough to show the edge of his shoulder. A scar ran there, ragged and faded, following the line of his collarbone and disappearing below the fabric. Not a whip scar. Something else. Something made by metal, probably. Probably more than one piece of it. "Army," he said. "Frontier, posting 1,869. Ambush in a canyon. 3 men didn't walk out." He let the shirt settle back into place. "I rode 100 miles with a piece of shrapnel in my shoulder because we couldn't stop, and I was the one who knew the terrain." He looked at the fire. "I was 21. Marin looked at the side of his face. "Does it still bother you?" she asked. "When it rains?" He took a drink of coffee. "Less than it used to." She absorbed that. "Less than it used to," she repeated quietly, almost to herself. He glanced at her. Just briefly. It wasn't a promise exactly. He hadn't said it would stop hurting, or that time fixed everything, or any of the things people said when they didn't know what else to offer. He just said less than it used to, and somehow that was more honest and more useful than anything else she'd heard in 2 years. She looked back at the fire. The camp was settling. Men spread their bedrolls close to the warmth, too exhausted for conversation. Santos was already asleep, sitting up with his back against a saddlebag. Even Micah's eyes were closing, his chin dropping toward his chest. After a time, Gideon stood. He looked down at the camp, checking it the way he always did, running the count in his head. "You kept those barrels," he said. She looked up at him. "If the flour and salt had gone, we'd be looking at real trouble by Kansas." He picked up his hat from the ground and set it back on his head. That was good thinking. Better than good. He walked off to check the horses. Marin sat by the fire a while longer. Her shoulder ached dully, and her hands were raw, and the knee she'd cut was starting to stiffen in the cold. She was tired in a way that went down to the bone, but the barrels were secure. The wagon was standing. The crew was alive and breathing around her in the dark. She pulled her coat a little tighter and stayed by the fire until the sky started turning gray at the edges, because the coffee would need to be ready when the men woke up, and the men would wake up soon. She was still the camp cook. The storm was gone, and she was still here. The Red River came into view on a Thursday afternoon, and it was nothing like Marin had imagined. She'd pictured something romantic in the name, red water, maybe, or red clay banks. Something that looked the way the word sounded. What she got was a wide brown, sluggish ribbon of water moving between low, muddy banks, choked with cottonwood and scrub willow on both sides, the color of old coffee, smelling of silt and something organic and slow. The crossing would wait until morning. The current was still too high from the storm system that had pushed through 3 days ahead of them, and Gideon wouldn't risk the herd in moving water with uncertain footing. They made camp on the south bank, with the river sounds in the background, the pull of the current, the occasional crack of a branch working loose upstream. The frogs that started up at dusk in a chorus, so loud it drowned out conversation past 20 feet. It was the first afternoon in 3 weeks that ended early enough to call it rest. The crew took full advantage. Micah and 2 of the older hands were asleep under a stand of cottonwood before the sun touched the horizon. Santos sat cross-legged mending a cinch strap, his needle moving in small, patient arcs. Laramie was throwing his hat at a fence post. Someone had driven into the bank years ago and left behind, retrieving it each time with the focused determination of a man with nothing better to do. Gideon found Marin at the wagon, checking the supply inventory for the 3rd time that week. It was a habit she'd developed, running the count, estimating consumption against miles remaining, adjusting the rations in her head. She'd found 2 pounds of cornmeal going damp in the bottom of a sack and had spread it on the wagon's tailgate to dry in the afternoon heat. He stopped beside the wagon and looked at the cornmeal. Then he looked at her. "Leave that to dry," he said. "Come with me." She glanced up. "I need to finish the mine. It'll be there when you get back." He was already moving toward the horse line. "Come on." She set down her notebook and followed. He saddled a gentle roan mare, for her not her usual draft mule, but a proper riding horse, short-backed and calm-eyed. He watched her mount without offering help, and when she settled into the saddle with more confidence than she'd had 3 weeks ago, something in his expression registered it without comment. They rode south along the riverbank for about a quarter mile, away from camp, away from the sound of Laramie and his hat. The cottonwoods thinned out, and the bank opened into a flat, dry clearing, maybe 60 yards across, with a low cut bank on the far side, where the river had changed its mind about its course sometime in the past, and left a wall of exposed earth about chest high. Gideon dismounted and tied his horse to a root spur. Marin dismounted and tied hers beside it. He reached into his saddlebag and brought out a Colt .45 revolver. Not his own, she recognized his worn and dark-handled, always at his hip. This one was newer, cleaner. The metal still had a faint blue sheen to it that hadn't been worn off by years of weather and use. He turned it in his hand once and then held it out to her. Grip first. She took it. It was heavier than she'd expected. She turned it over carefully, the way she'd seen Gideon handle his, keeping the muzzle pointed toward the ground. "You've held one before?" he asked. "Roy had one. I never touched it." "All right." He stepped beside her. and slightly behind, and he talked her through it without touching the gun or her hands, how to check the cylinder, how to count the loads, how to set her feet. He told her to square her hips toward the cut bank and let the weight of the gun rest in the natural cup of her grip, not to fight it, not to white-knuckle it. He told her to breathe out before she pulled the trigger, not hold her breath. She listened. She adjusted her feet. She raised the gun. "This gun doesn't make you better than anyone else, Marin," he said, from behind her left shoulder. "It just reminds them that you have the right to say no." She absorbed that for a moment. Then she exhaled, slow and steady, and pulled the trigger. The shot hit the cut bank 6 inches high and a foot wide of where she'd aimed. The recoil moved up her arm to her shoulder, the bruised one, which she'd known was coming and braced for anyway. She adjusted her grip. Second shot, closer. Third shot. She clipped the edge of an exposed root in the cut bank and saw the dirt kick up exactly where she'd meant to aim. Gideon said nothing for a moment, then again. She reloaded slowly, her fingers learning the motion, and fired the cylinder twice more. By the end of the second cylinder, she was hitting center mass of a rough circle she'd drawn with a stick in the face of the cut bank. Not every shot, not most of them, but enough to understand where her eye was and where the barrel was, and how to bring them into agreement. When she lowered the gun, her hand was tingling, and her shoulder ached, and she was smiling without entirely meaning to. Gideon was looking at the cut bank. "You've got a steady eye," he said. It was a plain statement of fact, not a compliment designed to encourage her. She'd come to understand the difference with him. "My hands shake a little," she said. "Everyone's do the first time." He took the gun back, reloaded it with the efficiency of long practice, and held it back out to her. Again, they stayed at the cut bank until the light started to go golden and horizontal, slanting through the cottonwood leaves in long, flat bars. By then, her aim had gotten consistent enough that she could hit a point-sized knot in the cut bank, face 4 times out of 6, which, Gideon said, with his characteristic economy, was adequate. "What does adequate mean on this drive?" she asked. "It means if something comes at you and you need to stop it, you can." He holstered his own gun. "Adequate is what keeps you alive. Better than adequate takes practice you don't have yet." "Then I'll practice." "Yes," he said simply. "You will." He taught her to clean the gun that evening, sitting at the tailgate of the chuck wagon after supper, the crew scattered around the fire or already sleeping. He talked her through the disassembly, the same way he'd talked her through the shooting. Step by step, patient, precise, no repetition. He expected her to remember what he said the first time, which she found she preferred to being talked at, slowly, as though she might not understand. She reassembled the Colt twice by lamplight, getting slower and more deliberate on the second pass, making sure the motion was in her hands and not just in her head. He watched, drank his coffee, and didn't interfere. She set the reassembled gun on the tailgate between them. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead."
"Were you a scout before you were a trail boss?"
"Yes." "How long you thought about it?" 8 years. Army contract, mostly. Some private work after. "Is that where you learned the terrain? For the drives?" He picked up his cup. "Partly. Partly I just rode it enough times to remember it." He looked out toward the river. "First drive I ran, I got the herd 50 miles off course in Kansas, because I trusted another man's map instead of my own eyes. Lost 11 days correcting it." He took a drink. "I don't use other people's maps anymore." Marin looked at the Colt on the tailgate between them. "I don't think I'm going to need it," she said. "The gun. I hope I don't. That's the right way to feel about it," Gideon said. The wolf came 2 mornings later. It came out of the scrub brush on the eastern side of the horse line. At first light, moving in the low, stiff-legged lope of a sick or injured animal head down, hackles raised, foam at the jaw. Laramie saw it first because he was at the horse line, checking his mare's shoes when it cleared the brush. And what he did was exactly what most people would do. He froze. The mare screamed. She threw her head back and yanked at the tie line and got her hooves under her, in the wide, frantic stance of an animal, preparing to bolt or kick. The wolf came straight at her, no hesitation, locked onto the noise and the movement and the smell of prey, and Laramie was directly between them, with no weapon in his hands and nowhere fast to go. Marin was 15 feet away at the chuck wagon, fire going, coffee on, hands already starting the biscuit dough. She heard the mare and looked up, took in the wolf and Laramie, and the distance between them, and she wiped her hands on her apron. She reached under the wagon seat for the colt. She walked toward the horse line. Not running would spook the mare worse and give the wolf a moving target. She walked at a pace that was fast without being chaotic, and she called out to Laramie as she came. Step left, don't run. Step left and don't move after. He heard her. He stepped left. He stopped moving. She raised the colt, exhaled the way Gideon had shown her, and shot the wolf through the chest at 12 feet. It dropped immediately. No second shot needed. The mare pulled and screamed for another 30 seconds, then settled into trembling and blowing hard. Laramie stood where she'd told him to stand, his face the color of old dough, his hat on the ground where it had fallen. The camp was awake and moving within a minute. Men came out of their bedrolls, with their hands reaching for weapons that weren't needed anymore. Gideon came out of his tent and looked at the wolf on the ground. He looked at the horse, still trembling but unhurt. He looked at Laramie. Then he looked at Marin, who had already lowered the colt and was walking back toward the chuck wagon because the biscuit dough wasn't going to work itself. Nobody said anything for a moment. Laramie walked over to his mare. He ran his hand down her neck, checking her over, talking to her in a low voice. She was fine shaken, but fine, not a mark on her. He stood there with his hand on her neck for a long moment. Then he turned around, found his hat in the dirt, put it back on his head, and looked at Marin's back as she bent over the fire. He reached up and took his hat off again, and he held it to his chest. Cull saw it, and did the same, slow, and without any self-consciousness about it. Then Micah, which surprised her more than anything else. One by one, the men at the horse line tipped their hats in her direction. Not dramatically, just a clean, simple gesture that meant one specific thing on a cattle drive. You're one of us. She didn't turn around in time to see most of it. Santos told her about it later, quietly, while he was helping her collect firewood. She didn't make a fuss over it. But that evening, when she was alone at the wagon doing the inventory, she let herself smile about it. For a little while, 3 days north of the main crossing, the Red River split. It wasn't on any of the maps Gideon carried. Or if it was, the cartographer had drawn it wrong. What should have been a straightforward push toward the Kansas line turned into a morning of riding the bank looking for a ford, where the two channels narrowed enough to attempt with a full herd. By midday, they'd found it barely a gravel bar that stretched 2/3 of the way across the shallower channel before dropping off into deeper water that would have to be swum. They camped early on a wide, flat shelf of land between the two channels. Fog came in with the evening, which wasn't unusual for low ground near water, but this fog was thick and stayed thick, wrapping the cottonwoods in gray and deadening sound in the way that made the night feel muffled and close. Marin built the fire in close to the wagon and kept it fed, because the damp made everything harder to sleep, harder to stay warm, harder to feel settled. The men ate quickly and went to their bedrolls, the night riders heading out into the gray-white dark, with nothing to navigate by but sound and instinct. She stayed up after the others went down. She always did. There were pots to clean and tomorrow's dry goods to measure out. And she'd found a weak seam in one of the flour sacks that needed stitching before it gave way entirely. She was at the far side of the wagon, on the riverside, stitching the flour sack by the light of a single lamp she'd hung low on the wagon's side bracket when she heard voices, not far away, 10 feet, maybe less, on the other side of the wagon, Gideon's voice and Micah's, close enough that she could hear every word through the fog and the canvas. "I've been thinking about the ranch," Gideon said. His voice was low, the voice he used when he was talking about something that mattered. when this drive ends. Thinking, what about it? Micah said. It's sprawling up there. Good land, but it's empty, running an outfit that size alone. A pause. When this drive ends, I need a woman to keep the place running. Marin's needle stopped moving. She sat very still on the overturned bucket, the flour sack in her lap, the lamp throwing a circle of yellow light on the ground around her feet. She heard Micah say something low that she couldn't catch, and then the sound of boots moving away through the grass. And then nothing but the fog and the frogs and the slow pull of the river. She finished the seam. She did it mechanically, the needle going in and out with the same rhythm it had before, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She'd known Gideon had a ranch in Wyoming. He'd mentioned it in passing. The way you mention a destination, not a home, she'd known this drive was heading there. She'd told herself, carefully and repeatedly, that whatever was building between them in the evenings by the fire was simple proximity. Two people doing difficult work in difficult conditions, finding each other reasonable company. That was all. But she'd started to think. She started to think that maybe he looked at her the way he did, because there was something behind it. The way he'd noticed the drag marks, where she'd moved the wheel chocks alone. The way he'd told her she had a steady eye, like it was something worth saying. The way he'd sat beside her in the rain, the night of the stampede, and shown her his own scars without being asked. She'd been careful. She'd told herself she was being careful. But somewhere in the last 3 weeks, careful had started to slip. And now she sat in the fog with a repaired flour sack in her lap and heard his words turning over in her head. I need a woman to keep the place running. Not, I want you there. Not, I'd like for you to consider. Need a woman, keep the place running. It was labor. That was what she was. She'd been useful on the drive, proven herself in the work, and now she was being appraised the way you appraised any good tool for future use. Take it north. Put it to work on the ranch. Square the accounts. She set the flour sack down and pressed her palms flat against her thighs for a moment. Then she put out the lamp, went under the wagon to her bedroll, and lay down in the dark with the fog pressing in on all sides. She stared at the underside of the wagon. The wood above her was scarred and warped from weather and use, bolted and cross-braced, held together by iron and rope, and the accumulated decisions of every drive it had survived. She knew every inch of it by now. She'd been sleeping under it for 3 weeks. She thought about Wyoming. She thought about how far she'd come and what she'd done to get here, and how little she wanted to be useful to someone else's life on someone else's terms ever again. Roy had needed her for cooking and cleaning and keeping quiet. Coulter had needed her to work off a debt she'd never agreed to. And now Gideon. She stopped herself there. She wasn't going to decide anything. Tonight, she was going to sleep, and in the morning she was going to do her job, and that was what mattered. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep well. The attack came at midday. The fog hadn't fully lifted it, had thinned in the morning sun to something gauzy and drifting, the kind that lay low over the water and rose up in pockets between the trees, and it moved with the faint breeze that came off the river in long, slow curtains. Visibility was down to maybe 30 yards. The herd was settled and grazing on the flat shelf of land. The men dispersed around the perimeter in the easy looseness of a midday lull. Marin heard the horses before she saw anything. Too many hooves, coming in too fast from the south, and none of them belonging to her outfit. She straightened up from the water barrel she'd been filling and looked toward the sound, and through a gap in the fog she saw them 6 riders, maybe 7, moving in fast, and spread out in the way of men who have planned their approach. At their head was a big man on a gray horse, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw like river stone. Her entire body went cold. Coulter Vance. He rode into camp with his men flanking wide on both sides, cutting off the natural retreat lines before anyone had time to set a position. The herd sensed the disruption and began to shift and mill, the cattle on the south edge pushing north in a restless wave. 2 of Gideon's night riders were caught in the open, with the cattle between them and the camp. Gideon stepped forward from beside the chuck wagon. He was unarmed to the eye, his gun on his hip, hands loose at his sides, nothing aggressive in his posture. "This is a private drive," he said. "State your business." Coulter pulled his gray horse up 10 feet away. He looked past Gideon to where Marin stood at the water barrel. His eyes settled on her with the flat, proprietary quality she remembered from the cabin doorway back in Texas. "My business is that woman," he said. "She has outstanding debts under my family name, and I've come to collect." "She's a hired hand on my drive," Gideon said. "She's under contract. She's a Vance." Coulter's voice didn't change, and I didn't ride 300 miles to argue law with a cattleman. He looked at Marin again. "Come here." She didn't move. Coulter looked back at Gideon. Something shifted in his face. "I'll also be taking those cattle to settle additional losses your outfit caused me in the pursuit. We can do this with a bill of transfer, or we can do it with a fight. Either way, the cattle are going south." The fog moved. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then everything happened at once. Coulter's men drew first, which Gideon had anticipated, and the camp came alive with the sound of shots fired through the fog. Marin went for the Colt under the wagon seat and dropped behind the wagon wheel. Through the white drifting haze, she could see shapes moving, men on horseback, men on foot, the crack of gunshots muffled and strange in the thick air, the cattle beginning to run north in a panicked surge. She saw Gideon go down. He was 15 feet to her left, returning fire from behind a water trough, and then one of Coulter's men came around the southest side of the wagon at a dead run, and the shot caught Gideon in the chest, and he went down sideways into the mud of the riverbank. The current got him before anyone could reach him. The Red River was moving fast and cold, and it didn't ask permission. It took Gideon Thorne off the bank in seconds, and by the time Marin had gotten to the edge of the water, she could see nothing in the fog and the churning brown current, nothing except his hat, waterlogged and dark. Turning slowly in the pull of the river, she screamed his name. Coulter's arm came around her from behind. She felt the cold edge of a bowie knife at her throat, flat against her skin, and his voice was close and low in her ear. "Come quietly," he said, "and I won't go back for the rest of them." The herd was scattered across a quarter-mile of foggy bottomland. The camp was in chaos, men regrouping, someone shouting for a count. The shots had stopped, but the fog held everything in suspension. She couldn't tell who was standing, who wasn't. Gideon's hat floated past in the current and disappeared into the gray. Coulter pulled her backward into the tree line, and the fog closed in behind them, thick and silent, and the sounds of the river and the scattered cattle faded into nothing, and her screams went with them. The last thing she saw of the camp was the lamp she'd left burning at the wagon, its small yellow light barely visible through the mist. Then that too was gone. The canyon came into view at dusk. It was a deep cut in the red rock, narrow at the mouth and widening inside, sheltered on 3 sides by walls that rose 40 feet and blocked the wind completely. Someone had been using it for a long time. There were fire rings, old and new, and a rope line strung between 2 iron stakes driven into the rock face, and a lean-to structure against the east wall built from rough-cut timber and canvas that had seen better weather. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on any map by accident. Someone had chosen it carefully and used it often and didn't want it found. Coulter pushed her inside ahead of him and tied her wrists to a ring bolt sunk in the canyon wall. Not tight enough to cut off blood, but tight enough that she couldn't work the knot without something to cut with. He'd taken her Colt at the river. He'd checked her boots for a knife and found nothing, because she'd started keeping her butcher knife strapped to the inside of her left forearm 3 weeks ago after the storm, under her sleeve, where it sat flat and invisible. He hadn't checked there. She didn't move toward it yet. She sat against the wall and breathed and watched. There were 7 men in the canyon, counting Coulter. They'd ridden hard to get here, and they were tired and hungry, and their horses needed water. which meant the next hour or two would be consumed with the basic logistics of men who had pushed themselves past comfort. Tired men made mistakes. Hungry men got sloppy. She'd cooked for 12 cowboys for nearly a month, and she knew exactly what exhaustion did to a person's attention. Coulter untied her wrists after a while and told her to make herself useful. He said it the same way. He'd said everything since Texas with the flat assurance of a man who had never been seriously told no. You want to eat, he said. You cook. The canyon had provisions, a rough cache of flour, dried beans, some salt pork wrapped in cloth, and a canvas sack of various herbs and wild harvested roots that someone in the gang apparently knew something about foraging. She went through it methodically, her face giving away nothing, her mind moving fast. Mountain hemlock grew in the higher elevations and along sheltered canyon walls. In this part of the territory, she had seen it twice in the past 2 weeks. Riding near the supply wagon, delicate white flower clusters, fern-like leaves, stems with a distinctive purplish mottling. She'd noted it, the way she noted everything useful, cataloged it alongside the edible plants and the medicinal ones and the dangerous ones, because on a long drive that knowledge was worth carrying. She looked at the canyon walls while she set water to boil. There it was, growing in a dark patch near the base of the north wall, where the moisture collected from some underground seep. Not much of it enough. She gathered firewood and kept her back to the men while she worked. She moved unhurried, domestic, every motion broadcasting that she was doing exactly what they expected of her, and nothing else. She had learned this particular performance during 2 years of marriage to Roy. Make yourself invisible inside the task. Let them stop watching. She slipped away from the fire under the pretext of gathering more wood from the canyon mouth, where a pile of deadfall had been stacked. She pulled a handful of hemlock leaves, and stem not too much. She wasn't trying to kill anyone. She was trying to clear the room long enough to get out of it. She knew the dosage the way she knew her cornmeal ratios, by feel and by knowledge. Sleep-inducing, not fatal, if she kept it measured. She stripped the leaves, mashed them against a flat rock with her boot heel, and folded them into the center of the bean stew where the flavor of the salt pork would cover most of the bitterness. She stirred it through twice and put the lid on, and went back to tending the fire. Coulter watched her from across the canyon. He was leaning against the lean-to post with his arms crossed and his eyes narrow, the way he watched everything, looking for angles, calculating. She kept her face mild and her hands busy, and she served the food when it was ready without being asked. She did not eat any herself, she told Coulter, when he raised an eyebrow at her empty plate that she had no appetite after the riding. He shrugged and ate. She sat against the wall and waited. It took about an hour. One man went first, his chin dropping to his chest mid-conversation, and then the man beside him, and then it moved through the camp like a slow tide going out. Coulter lasted longer than the others. He was a big man with a hard constitution, and he fought it, his eyes going heavy and then opening again, his head lifting each time it fell. He looked at her once, near the end, with something in his face that was half suspicion and half something else entirely. Then his eyes closed and didn't open again. She counted to 60, twice. Then she moved. She pulled the butcher knife from her forearm and cut the piece of rope that had been left looped at her wrist for quick retying. She found her Colt on Coulter's belt, lifted it clean, and checked the cylinder by touching the dark, because the fire had burned low, and she wasn't going to risk feeding it with these men 2 feet away. 4 rounds left. She reloaded from Coulter's own ammunition belt, which felt appropriate. She found a position at the narrow canyon mouth where she could see both the entrance and the camp behind her, put her back to the rock, and settled in. She thought about Gideon going into the river. She didn't let that thought open all the way. She kept it closed and set it aside. The way you set aside a task you can't do yet, because you're in the middle of a different one. She was alive. She had a weapon. She was not restrained. These were the facts that mattered right now. She watched the canyon mouth, and she breathed. They came before dawn. She heard the horses first, then Laramie's voice, lower than she'd ever heard it, calling her name from the darkness outside the canyon mouth. "Here," she said. "I'm at the entrance. The men are down. Don't make noise with your horses. You'll wake them." Laramie appeared out of the dark on foot, leading his horse by the bridle, his face doing something complicated when he saw her standing upright and armed against the canyon wall. Behind him came Santos and Cull and 3 others from the outfit. And Gideon. He was moving carefully. One arm held slightly away from his body, his shirt dark on the left side, where the wound had been bandaged with what looked like strips of someone's undershirt. His face was pale and set hard, and he was upright by what appeared to be sheer stubbornness. He found her eyes in the dark and held them for a long moment. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm all right," she said. "They're asleep, all 7 of them." He looked past her into the canyon. "How?" "The stew." A beat of silence. "You put them down with the stew," he said. "Mountain hemlock. Measured dose. They'll sleep 4, maybe 5 more hours before it wears off." She looked at him. "You need to sit down." "Not yet." "Gideon." "Not yet." He straightened fully, which clearly cost him something. He turned to the men behind him. "Cull, Santos, secure their horses and collect the weapons. Laramie, tie the hands of the ones on the ground. Use good knots." He looked at her again. "The marshal I sent a rider to the territorial marshal 2 days ago, before the crossing. He should be a half day behind us." She stared at him. "You knew Coulter was coming?" "I suspected." Someone in the last supply town had been asking questions about the drive. Too specific. He moved past her into the canyon. Slowly, 1 step at a time. "I should have moved faster on it." She fell in beside him. "You were shot and in a river before that." She didn't argue with him because he was right, and also because she could see from his color that he didn't have much left to spend. She got her shoulder under his good arm without ceremony, and he let her, which told her more about how he was actually feeling than anything he'd said. The crew worked quickly and quietly. Coulter's men were tied, and their weapons stacked at the canyon mouth before any of them showed signs of waking. The horses were secured to the rope line. Laramie built the fire up, and Marin put coffee on, because there was nothing to do now but wait for the marshal. And waiting went better with coffee. Gideon sat against the canyon wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, and she checked his bandage. The wound had bled through, but not badly. The bullet had gone through the meat at the outside edge of his chest, missing anything vital by inches that she preferred not to think about too carefully. "You need a real doctor," she said. "There's one in the next town north." "How far?" "Day and a half." She tightened the bandage and said nothing. He watched her hands work. Around them the crew settled in, some sleeping in short shifts, some watching the canyon. Micah took up a post at the entrance and sat there with his rifle across his knees and hat pulled down, as solid as a piece of the rock itself. At some point, Laramie crouched down near Marin at the fire and said, quietly and without preamble, "I told the men you took the whole gang down by yourself with a cooking pot and a borrowed knife." Marin looked at him. "That's not exactly what happened," she said. "It's close enough," Laramie said, and went back to his post. Santos caught her eye from across the fire and shrugged with a small smile. She looked around the canyon. Micah at the entrance, Cull checking the horses, Gideon watching her from the wall with steady, tired eyes. The 7 men of Coulter's gang sleeping the deep, involuntary sleep of the thoroughly outmaneuvered. She thought about Gideon's words at the river crossing, half-heard through fog and canvas. "I need a woman to keep the place running." She thought about how she'd lain under the wagon afterward, staring at the wood above her, feeling the cold, familiar weight of being appraised as useful. She looked at the men around her now, men who had ridden through the night with a wounded boss to a canyon they didn't know, to get back someone they considered their own. "Marin is part of this chuckwagon outfit. We don't leave our own behind." She hadn't been there to hear Gideon say it. Laramie told her later. riding into the canyon dark, his voice matter-of-fact about it, like it was just the plain truth stated plainly. She poured herself coffee. She sat down beside the fire. She was still angry about the words she'd heard. That was real, and it wasn't going away. But she was also here, and so were they, and the fire was warm against the cold canyon walls. That was enough for tonight. The marshal arrived at mid-morning. His name was Irident, a lean, gray-haired man who rode a dark bay gelding, and wore his badge the way most men wore buttons, just part of the clothing, nothing to announce. He had 2 deputies with him, both young, both quietly competent, in the way of men who have been trained well and left to work without much ceremony. He took in the canyon at a glance, the 7 bound men, Coulter Vance, with his eyes open now, and a headache visible in every line of his face, the Thorn outfit settled in around the fire, with the calm of people who had already handled the difficult part. He shook Gideon's hand and looked at the wound and told him he needed a doctor. "I know it," Gideon said. "Today," Dent said. After Gideon said, and Dent looked at him the way men look at each other, when they've both decided something, and neither one is moving, and then he moved on. He walked the perimeter of the canyon. He looked at the bound men, checked the knots, looked at the weapons stacked near the entrance. He asked Marin 3 questions where she'd been taken from, what route Coulter had used, what provisions and supplies were in the cache, and wrote her answers in a small notebook with a pencil that needed sharpening. He listened without interrupting, and he didn't ask anything twice. Then he walked over to where Coulter sat against the lean-to-post, wrists bound in front of him, and crouched down to eye level. Coulter looked at him with the eyes of a man assembling his arguments. "That woman has debts owed to my family. I was pursuing a legal claim with 7 armed men," Dent said. "The drive resisted a lawful. You attempted to steal 3,000 head of cattle," Dent said, his voice the same temperature it had been the whole time. "You kidnapped a civilian at knife point. You shot the trail boss of a legal outfit." He stood back up. "I've got 3 witnesses to the cattle, 2 to the kidnapping and 1 to the shooting." He looked at Coulter. "If those debts you're talking about are legal, you can bring documentation to the territorial court in Cheyenne, in writing, through a lawyer." He paused. "From jail." Coulter said nothing. Dent walked back to Gideon. The camp prepared to move. The deputies organized Coulter's men for the ride back south, which was its own logistical undertaking, 7 men on horses, 2 deputies, and the collected weapons wrapped in a canvas bundle that one of the deputies slung across his pommel. Dent was efficient about it. He'd done this before. Before they rode out, Coulter was brought to his feet by the 2 deputies. He looked across the camp at Marin, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who was already planning the next move in a game that had no end. She'd seen that look on Roy sometimes. The look of someone who didn't think consequences applied to them in any permanent way. She stepped forward. The deputies looked at Gideon, who gave a small nod. She walked up to Coulter and stood in front of him for a moment. Then she pulled her Colt and shot him in the leg, clean through the meat of the thigh, and he went down hard on one knee, with a sound that was more surprise than pain. The pain would come later, she knew from experience, once the shock wore off. One of the deputies moved. Dent held up his hand, and the deputy stopped. Marin lowered the gun. "That's for every woman who couldn't," she said, "and this ends here. Whatever Roy owed you, it's buried with him. Come after me again, and I'll have a lawyer in Cheyenne waiting with documents that will put you away for longer than either of us will live." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped back and holstered the Colt. Dent looked at the leg wound with the appraising eye of a man calculating medical necessity versus inconvenience. "I'll have him seen to," he said. He looked at Marin. "That was outside my jurisdiction to authorize." "I know," she said. "I didn't see it," he said, and walked to his horse. Coulter was helped onto his horse by the deputies, jaw tight, face white, not saying anything. He looked at Marin once more as they rode out. She held his gaze until he looked away first. Then she turned around and went back to the chuck wagon. The canyon was quiet once the marshal's party was out of sight. The crew stood around for a moment in the particular silence that follows a long-held tension, finally releasing the kind of silence where no one quite knows what to do with their hands. Laramie sat down on a rock and took his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at the ground. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. "Well," Cull agreed. Micah picked up the coffee pot, found it empty, and started toward the fire to make more. Ordinary motion. Ordinary purpose. It broke the spell. Santos began loading the recovered supplies back onto the chuck wagon. Two of the other hands caught the horses that had scattered during the commotion. Gideon stood near the canyon mouth, one hand resting against the rock face, watching his outfit reassemble itself around him. Marin came to stand beside him. "We're half a day behind where we should be," he said. "We'll make it up," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You sleeping under this canyon tonight, or you want to push north?" "North," she said immediately. He almost smiled. "North it is." They rode out of the canyon at noon with the sun straight overhead and the red rock walls dropping away on both sides. The crew fell into the familiar formation point riders ahead, swing and flank riders working the sides of the herd, drag riders at the back eating the dust of 3,000 cattle. The chuck wagon rolled at the edge of it all, and Marin drove with the reins in both hands, and her face turned into the wind. She breathed the clean air and let the canyon fall behind. Coulter Vance was in custody. His claim on her, legal or otherwise, was finished. Marshal Dent had enough to hold him through a proper trial, and Gideon had documentation of the drive's legal standing that would make any counterclaim difficult. She wasn't a lawyer, and she didn't pretend to know exactly how it would fall out in the courtroom, but she knew this. Nobody was coming after her anymore. She could feel the difference. She'd felt Coulter's presence for months like something at her back, a weight she couldn't put down. It was gone now, and the absence of it was almost physical. Wyoming was still ahead. The words she'd overheard at the river were still in her head, turning. She hadn't forgotten them, and she wasn't ready to set them aside. But she was free, not because someone had given her freedom, because she had gone into a canyon in the dark with a knife strapped to her arm, and she had thought her way out, and the law had come and done its work, and now it was done. She'd walked out on her own 2 feet. That was hers to keep, and nobody was ever going to take it from her again. By mid-afternoon, they had the cattle moving in the long, easy rhythm of a herd that had settled into the drive. Hooves raising slow red dust, the outriders' horses small and dark at the edges of the wide brown mass. The plains opened up ahead, vast and indifferent, and full of sky. Laramie rode up alongside the chuck wagon for a while, his horse matching pace with the mules. "That was something back there," he said. She kept her eyes on the trail. It was necessary. Still something. He rode in silence for a moment. "I was wrong, you know, what I said at the start. About you being bad luck." She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his ears red under the brim of his hat. "I know," she said. "Well," he said, "just so it's said." He turned his horse and rode back to the herd. Marin looked at the horizon, long and flat and burning gold in the afternoon light, reaching all the way to where the sky came down to meet it. She clicked her tongue at Chester and Blind Tom, and the mules leaned in, and the wagon rolled north. The fever came on the 3rd day out of the canyon. Gideon had made it to the next town north on sheer stubbornness, the way Marin had suspected he would, and the doctor there had cleaned the wound and stitched it, and told him flatly that he needed 2 weeks of bed rest and a month away from hard riding. Gideon had listened to all of this with the patient expression of a man who had no intention of doing any of it, paid the doctor in coin, and walked back out to the wagon. The fever started quietly. A little more stillness than usual in the evenings. A slower answer when someone spoke to him. By the 2nd night, his eyes had gone glassy, and his skin was hot to the touch, and Marin overruled him without discussion and moved his bedroll into the back of the chuck wagon where she could keep an eye on it. He didn't argue which told her everything about how bad he actually felt. She drove the wagon and nursed him at the same time, which meant the days blurred into a rhythm of checking his temperature and keeping the wound clean and making sure he drank enough water. She made broth from the salt pork and dried onion and made him drink it, whether he wanted to or not. She slept in 2-hour stretches, propped against the wagon seat, with a blanket across her knees, waking to check on him when the mules shifted or the wagon hit a rut. Micah watched all of this without comment for 2 days. On the third day, he took over the driving without being asked, climbing up onto the wagon seat in the early morning while Marin was tending the fire, taking the reins from where she'd left them, looped on the brake handle. He looked straight ahead and said nothing. She looked at his profile for a moment, then climbed into the wagon bed to check the bandage. Santos brought her meals without being asked. Cull kept the crew quiet in the evenings, shushing Laramie when he got loud near the wagon. They moved through it without ceremony, the crew adjusting around the situation, the way a river adjusts around a stone, quietly, naturally, without making a fuss of it. Gideon's fever broke on the fourth night. Marin was sitting cross-legged on the wagon bed beside him when it happened, mending a tear in one of the supply bags by the light of the small lamp, and she felt him stir and looked up and found his eyes open and focused for the first time in days. The glassy, distant quality was gone. He was back. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the canvas above him. He looked at her. "What day is it?" he said. His voice was rough. "Thursday," she said. "You've been out since Monday." He processed that. Then he tried to sit up. "Don't," she said, and put a hand flat on his sternum, which stopped him. He lay back. "How far behind are we?" "Half a day. Micah's been driving. The herd's fine." He looked at the ceiling of the wagon again. Quiet for a moment. "You've been here the whole time. Someone had to change the bandage." He turned his head toward her. "That's not what I meant." She didn't answer right away. She set down the mending and picked up the water tin and held it out to him. He took it and drank. And she watched him and thought about everything she'd been holding since the river crossing, since the words she'd heard through the fog and the canvas. "You need to eat something," she said. He handed the tin back. "Marin?" "What?" "Thank you." She looked at him. His face was thinner than it had been. 4 days of fever did that, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and the silver at his temples had caught the lamplight and gone almost white. He looked older and more human than she'd ever seen him. "You would have done it for any of the crew," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you did it because that's who you are. Those aren't the same thing." She was quiet. He shifted slightly against the blanket, wincing. "I need to tell you something about what you heard at the river." She stiffened, just slightly. "You heard me talking to Micah," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard enough." "Then you heard it wrong." He said it plainly. "No apology in it. Just correction. I told Micah my ranch is sprawling and empty. I told him when this drive ends, I need a woman to keep the place running." He looked at her steadily. "What I said to Micah and what I meant are 2 different things. I was talking around what I actually meant because I'm better at driving cattle than I am at saying things directly." She waited. "I don't need a housekeeper, Marin." His voice was quieter now. "I have enough money to hire 10 hands. I want you there because you're the only soul who makes me want to come home after these long drives." The lamp flickered once in a draft from the canvas seam. She sat with that for a moment. The words settled differently than she'd expected them to. Not like weight coming down, but like weight coming off. Slowly, the way a bruise stops hurting when you finally stop pressing on it. She thought about Roy, who had needed her for what she could do and called that love. She thought about Coulter, who had seen her as a debt to be collected. She thought about every man who had ever looked at her and seen a function. Gideon was looking at her like she was a person. She reached past him to the small bag she kept at the head of his bedroll, where she'd been sleeping close enough to hear if his breathing changed. She dug to the bottom of it and pulled out a small folded square of cloth blue cotton, soft and worn thin, cut from the corner of her mother's quilt. She'd carried it the whole drive. She'd almost thrown it away twice, once in Texas and once the night after the stampede, because she hadn't wanted to carry anything that came from before. She'd kept it anyway. She picked up her mending needle. She reached over Gideon's canvas coat, which was folded near his boots, and she found the inner lining, and she began to stitch the blue square into it, small careful stitches that pulled the cloth flat, and even, right over the left breast, right over where the heart sat underneath. Gideon watched her hands but didn't ask. When she finished, she set the coat back down and threaded her needle onto the edge of the mending bag. She didn't look at him. "My mother made that quilt before I was born," she said. She used to say the blue was for safe traveling. He was quiet for a moment. "Why that pocket?" "Because that's where you keep things you don't want to lose," she said. He looked at the coat, then he looked at her. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, and the wagon rolled on through the dark, with the sound of the cattle around them and the stars overhead through the gap in the canvas, cold and bright and unreachable and constant. After a while, he slept again, a clean, natural sleep this time, not the hot, restless unconsciousness of the fever. His breathing was even. His color was better. She turned down the lamp and sat with her back against the wagon side and listened to him breathe and thought about Wyoming, and what it might look like from a hill she'd never stood on, and whether the sky there was the same size as it was here or bigger. She thought it was probably bigger. She closed her eyes. The weather turned 2 weeks north of the Wyoming line. It came fast, the way mountain weather always does. One morning the sky was clear and sharp-edged, and by afternoon it had gone the color of a bruise, low and purple and moving. By evening, the wind had picked up from the northwest with real intention behind it, cold in the way that reaches down through wool and leather and sits on the bone. By midnight, it was snowing. Not a dusting, a proper early season blizzard. The kind nobody planned for. In late summer, the kind that killed cattle drives that weren't paying attention. Gideon was still recovering. He'd been on his feet for 5 days, increasingly insistent on doing his own work, and Marin had allowed it because fighting him burned more energy than it saved. But the fever had taken more out of him than he admitted, and by the second day of the storm, he was running hot again, not badly, not the drowning heat of before, but enough that she made him stay in the wagon bed, with 2 blankets and strict orders from the crew's combined authority. "You stay," Micah told him. At breakfast on the 3rd morning, in the same tone he used with difficult cattle. Gideon looked at him. "You stay," Marin said from the fire. Gideon stayed. She stepped into the gap without fanfare. There wasn't time for fanfare. The pass was ahead of them, a high cut through the mountain ridge that the maps showed as the only viable route north before the season locked it down, and the snow was coming from exactly the wrong direction, pushing straight into the mouth of it. She called the crew together. In the shelter of the wagon's lee side, 7 men gathered close against the wind, and she laid it out straight. "We move in the next hour, or we lose the pass," she said. "The herd has to go through in tight formation. No straggling, no wide drives. Point riders set the pace, and we hold it regardless of what the cattle want to do. If any animals go lame, we cut them and leave them. We cannot slow down for anything." She looked at each of them in turn. "Santos, I need hot stones from the fire wrapped in the spare canvas and distributed to the men before we move. I've been counting our wood. We have enough for 2 more campfires at reduced size, so we stop only when we have to. And we keep those fires small and hot, not big and wasteful. Any questions?" Laramie raised his hand slightly. "You want me at point?" "Yes, Cull rides with you. Micah takes the left flank." She looked at the others and assigned positions around the formation, naming each man, each position, watching them absorb it. These were men who knew their jobs better than she did in most ways, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. She was just the one holding the shape of the whole thing in her head, while Gideon couldn't. They moved out. The pass was brutal. There was no other word for it. The wind came through the cut in the ridge like something directed, funneled by the rock walls on both sides into a concentrated force that hit the cattle head-on and made them plant their feet and balk. Laramie and Cull worked the point animals with everything they had, pushing, flanking, cutting back around, buying 20 feet at a time. The snow was horizontal in the worst gusts, reducing visibility to the width of a few cattle lengths. Marin drove the chuck wagon through it, with her hat pulled low and both hands on the reins, and her body braced against the seat back. Chester leaned hard into the harness, and blind Tom followed, because Chester was leading, and Tom trusted Chester more than he trusted the wind. The wagon's wheels found ice twice on the upper ledges of the pass, and she felt the whole rig go sideways slightly before the wheels caught rock again, and both times she let out the reins slightly and talked to the mules in a steady voice until they steadied. She thought about what Gideon had told her about his first drive, trusting another man's map instead of his own eyes, losing 11 days. She kept her eyes on the rock face to her left and the trail surface directly ahead, reading each yard of ground as it came, not projecting, not guessing, just seeing what was actually there. The herd made it through the upper passage in 4 hours. The descent on the north side was gentler. The wind cut off as the trail dropped below the ridgeline, and the snow thinned to something manageable, and the cattle felt the easing of the pressure and began to move with more willingness. By the time they reached the lower plateau, where the trail widened into good flat ground, the herd was walking clean, and the men were still in their saddles, and the wagon was rolling. Marin pulled the chuck wagon to a stop at the first sheltered spot below the tree line and got down and started the fire. Her hands shook slightly while she built it. She noticed that and breathed through it and kept working. The kindling caught, and she got the coffee pot on and went to check the supply situation too. The stone warmers Santos had wrapped were still holding heat, and she redistributed those to the men who'd been on the exposed north flank longest. The crew came in one by one, cold and silent, and moving with the particular economy of exhausted people who need warmth before words. Laramie came in last. He unsaddled his horse, got the animal seen to, and then walked to the fire and stood over it with both hands out and his head down for a long moment. When he looked up, he found Marin on the other side of the flames. He took his hat off. "Thank you, Marin," he said. His voice was direct and without performance. "You saved this drive once again." She looked at him. She thought about the first day, when he'd said a woman on a cattle drive was bad luck. She thought about the morning with the wolf. She thought about all the mornings between those 2 mornings, every biscuit and pot of coffee and meal served in the dark and the wind. "We all did it," she said. "Yes," Laramie said, "but you held it together." He put his hat back on and poured himself coffee. She looked around the camp. 12 men warming their hands at a fire she'd built at the bottom of a mountain pass they'd come through, because she'd set the formation and called the positions and held the map in her head when Gideon couldn't. She felt the weight of that, and it wasn't heavy. It was solid. Gideon appeared at the wagon's back canvas a while later, wrapped in his blanket, his color better than it had been that morning. He looked at the camp, at the fire, at the men eating the soup she'd put on, at Marin standing at the fire with her coffee tin, talking quietly with Santos. He looked at the mountain behind them and the trail they'd come down and the open country ahead. He didn't say anything. He sat down on the tailgate and poured himself coffee and watched his outfit, alive and whole, on the other side of the pass, and the expression on his face was something that didn't have a simple name. After a while, Marin came and sat beside him on the tailgate without being asked. They drank their coffee and looked north, where the land opened up wide and flat and green, and somewhere out there, still a day's ride ahead, was Wyoming. The valley appeared on a Tuesday morning, and it stopped her cold. She'd been watching the terrain change for 2 days, the scrub and dry grass of the high plateau giving way to something lusher, greener, the soil darkening, the streams they crossed running clearer and colder. She'd noticed the way Gideon sat a little differently in the saddle when they crossed the last ridge, something easing in his shoulders that she'd never seen ease before. She'd filed that away and kept driving. And then the trail curved around a long shoulder of hill, and the valley opened below them, and she pulled the mules up without thinking, because she needed a moment to just look at it. It was enormous and green, in a way that South Texas never got deep. Rolling pasture running between two lines of mountains, split by a river that caught the morning light and held it. Cottonwoods and aspen followed the river in a winding gold-green line. In the far distance, where the valley widened into its broadest point, she could make out the dark lines of fence and the pale square of a large house and the dark mass of outbuildings around it. The cattle sensed the grass. 3,000 animals began to move faster without being pushed. The whole herd tilting toward the valley, the way water tilts toward low ground. The crew let them go. They brought the herd down over the next 2 hours, spreading them across the valley floor in the clean morning air, and by the time the counting was done and the final tally made, every animal was accounted for. 3,012 head, the extras having come from strays, picked up along the trail that had been too good to leave behind. The cattle buyer came out from the ranch to meet them. A compact man in a good coat who shook Gideon's hand and looked at the herd with the practiced eye of someone who did this for a living. They talked numbers that Marin couldn't hear from where she was unhitching the mules at the wagon. She watched Gideon's face through the conversation. It was his trail face, steady and unreadable, and then she watched the buyer write something in a ledger, and Gideon nod once, short and certain. Top prices. She could tell from the way Micah, standing nearby, crossed his arms and looked at the ground with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done what he set out to do. Gideon paid the crew that afternoon. In the yard of the ranch house, each man called forward in turn. He was methodical about it. Same as everything else, exact wages, exact amounts, plus a bonus for the canyon, which he mentioned without drama, and which the men received without excess reaction. When he called Marin's name, she stepped forward, and he counted out her wages without ceremony, the same wage he'd promised her 6 weeks ago in the dark outside a Texas cattle camp. She took it and counted it and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. The crew broke up slowly over the rest of the afternoon. Santos left first, riding south with a new horse. Gideon had sold him at cost. Cull went next, heading east toward family. The others followed one by one or in pairs, their goodbyes brief and genuine, a hand extended, a hat tip, a few words, and then the sound of hooves going down the valley road. Laramie was last. He shook Gideon's hand, then turned to Marin. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has a lot of things to say and is deciding which ones are worth saying. He extended his hand. She shook it. "You're the best camp cook I've ridden with," he said then, after a pause. "You're also the best shot." He mounted his horse and rode out, and she watched him go until he was small in the distance. Micah had already gone. He'd shaken her hand before anyone else, early in the afternoon while the counting was still being done, and said, "Good drive," in the same tone he used to say everything. She'd said the same back to him. He'd nodded, and that had been enough. The valley was quiet when Gideon came and found her. She was standing at the chuck wagon, which she'd driven one last time to the edge of the ranch yard and parked under a cottonwood. She'd been cleaning it out, the final accounting, checking every corner and barrel and bag, returning things to order. Old habit. She did it on the last day of every week, and today was the last day of everything. So it seemed right. He stopped beside her and stood there for a moment, looking at the valley. "Come with me," he said. He walked her up a long grassy hill at the eastern edge of the property. Moving slowly, his side was still healing. Would be for a while yet, and she matched his pace without making a point of it. The hill was steep enough that they were both breathing harder at the top, and then they stopped, and the view opened in all directions. The valley below, the river, catching the late afternoon sun. The mountains on both sides, blue and enormous. The ranch buildings, small and solid in the distance. All of it rolling out to every horizon under a sky that was, as she had suspected, bigger here than anywhere else she'd ever been. He reached into his coat, the canvas coat with the blue patch sewn into the lining, and pulled out a folded document. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was a land deed. Territorial standard form, official seal at the top, filled in with careful handwriting. She read it twice, because the first time through she didn't entirely believe it. 50% ownership, the ranch, the land, the water rights, registered in the Territorial Land Office under the name Marin Vance. She looked up at him. "This is registered already," she said. "Filed in Cheyenne 3 days ago. When I sent the rider ahead, he was watching her face. It's legal and binding. Has nothing to do with anything else. You earned your place on this drive same as any man I've ever paid. The land is yours because you're owed it." She looked back at the document. The handwriting was careful. Her name, spelled right, in ink that was already dry and fixed and permanent. "You did this before you said anything to me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed you to know it wasn't connected. What I'm going to say now has nothing to do with the deed. The deed is already done, and it's yours regardless." He looked out at the valley. "You earned your freedom with your own hands, Marin. You don't need to marry me to own this land. But if you choose to stay, I want us to build a life together, a home no fire can ever touch." The wind came up the hill from the valley, warm and smelling of grass and water. She stood on that hill and felt the solid weight of the deed in her hands, and thought about the night she'd climbed out a back window in South Texas with nothing but a canvas bag and a butcher knife and a direction. North, just north, and figure the rest out as it comes. She'd figured it out. She'd figured out how to cook over a wind-stolen fire, and how to shoot a colt, and how to dose a gang into sleep with what grew on a canyon wall. She'd figured out how to drive through a mountain pass in a blizzard and nurse a wounded man back to himself, and sew a piece of blue cloth into a coat lining with meaning that didn't need explaining. She'd figured out, somewhere along 2,000 miles of trail, that she was not the woman Roy Vance had spent 2 years trying to make her into. She'd known it before. Now she'd proved it. She reached into her coat and found the one thing she'd carried from the beginning and hadn't been able to put down, the old black mourning shawl, folded thin, tucked into the inner pocket. She'd worn it when Roy died and when she'd buried him and when she'd run. She'd stopped wearing it 2 weeks into the drive because it got in the way, but she'd kept it folded in her pocket. She hadn't been able to name, until right now, what she was waiting for. She pulled it out and looked at it once. Then she held it up into the wind coming strong and clean off the valley, and she let it go. It caught the air and tumbled up and away, over the edge of the hill and out across the wide open of it, diminishing until it was too small to see. She took Gideon's hand. He closed his fingers around hers, and they stood there together on the hill, with the valley below them, and the mountains around them, and the sky enormous and clear in every direction. "What do you want to do first?" he said. She thought about it. "Fix the fence line on the east side. I saw it from the trail. It needs 2 new posts, at least." He looked at her sideways. "That's what you want to do first." "The cattle are in that field," she said. He looked at the fence. He looked at the cattle. He looked at her. "All right," he said, with something in his voice that was as close to a laugh as she'd ever heard from him. "We'll fix the fence." They walked down the hill together, into the valley, into the long afternoon light that fell clean and gold across everything. Behind them the morning shawl was gone. Ahead of them was the rest of it, all of it, wide open and waiting, and entirely their own. Marin Vance didn't start this story as a hero. She started it as a 19-year-old girl, climbing out a back window in the middle of the night, wearing boots 2 sizes too big, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a butcher knife, and the desperate belief that somewhere out there, There had to be something better than what she was leaving behind. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have money. She didn't have anyone waiting for her at the other end. All she had was the decision to move, and that decision, made in the dark and in fear, was the bravest thing she ever did. That's the first thing this story wants you to take with you. The courage to leave, not the dramatic, movie version courage where everything feels clear and righteous and the music swells at exactly the right moment. The real kind. The kind that happens at midnight when you're scared and alone and you go anyway. Because staying has finally become more frightening than the unknown road ahead. Marin didn't know what the trail would ask of her. She just knew she couldn't stay where she was, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the only qualification you need is the willingness to take the first step. The second thing this story is about is what happens after that first step. Because leaving is one thing, but proving yourself day after day, meal after meal, storm after storm, in front of 12 men who didn't want you there, and a world that had no category for what you were trying to do, that's something else entirely. Marin didn't earn her place on that drive by being exceptional from the start. She earned it by getting up every single time something knocked her down. The fire went cold, she rebuilt it. The wheel hit her shoulder. She got up and secured the tarp. The fog rolled in, and the guns came out, and the man she'd started to trust went into the river, and she didn't fall apart. She counted her ammunition, and she made a plan, and she waited. That's not luck, that's character built one hard day at a time. And the lesson there is simple. Even if it isn't easy, your worth is not determined by how smoothly things go. It's determined by what you do when they don't. The third thing, and maybe the most important, is what Gideon did on that hill in Wyoming. He didn't hand Marin a deed to half his ranch because he loved her, though by then he did. He handed it to her before he said anything about love, precisely so she would know the two things were separate. The land was hers because she'd earned it. The choice of what came next was hers because it always should have been. He gave her the one thing that every person in her life had withheld the freedom to decide for herself, without pressure, without debt, without conditions attached. And in doing that, he gave her something Roy never had, and Coulter never would, genuine respect. True love, this story argues, doesn't look like ownership. It doesn't look like need, or control, or leverage. It looks like someone handing you the deed and stepping back and saying, this is yours regardless. What you do with the rest is up to you. That's what Marin's story is really about. Not a romance, though it is one. Not a survival story, though it is that too. It's a story about a woman discovering, mile by difficult mile, that she was never as small as the people around her needed her to be. It's a story about the difference between being needed and being valued, about the difference between a life you're trapped in and a life you've chosen, about what it means to walk away from everything that hurt you and build with your own hands, on your own terms, something that no fire can ever touch. Wherever you are right now, whatever window you're thinking about, climbing out of Marin's story is proof that the road on the other side is hard and long and worth every single mile. This story is a work of historical fiction created purely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, events, locations as depicted, and dialogue are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental. The historical setting of 1878 and references to the Chisholm Trail are used as creative backdrop only and are not intended as a precise historical record. The portrayal of plant-based substances in this story is fictional and should not be referenced for real-world use. Viewer discretion is advised for themes involving abuse, violence, and mature situations.